Thank you, Sam. Thank you for those very kind words, and thank you even more for including me in this wonderful, wonderful discussion in this wonderful city. I am so pleased and honored to be here today to talk about the future of urban life in a place that is, I believe, a model for the entire world. But I want to start far away from Vancouver. I want to start in in the crowded streets of Dharavi, a slum in Mumbai. And Dharavi is, in many ways, the most entrepreneurial place I have ever been on this planet. You walk into a room and there are a couple of guys sewing brassieres and you swear you're in the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1907. And then you go across the street and there are women who are sitting on the ground and they're going through little plastic works, engaged in recycling plastic goods. And then a little further down there's a ceramics cluster making these beautiful little pots, and they're so proud of them they won't even take your money when they give one to you. And then you go a little bit further on and there are guys who are sleeping on their piled boxes that they're recycling, which means tearing the boxes out and turning them inside around so you can't see the labels on them. An amazing place showing the power of cities to transform the developing world. Of course, then you walk out in the middle of the street and the streets aren't paved and there are kids who are defecating in the street, and you realize that, while India is a place of incredible human potential, it's also a place where the government is too often failing its citizens. And it's failing its citizens not only by its inactivity, by a failure to provide the clean water and decent streets and decent infrastructure that all cities need, but it's also failing them in another way, by doing too much. For Mumbai has suffered over the past 50 years under one of the most draconian land use regimes in the entire world. A floor area or floor space ratio of 1.25 exists throughout much of the downtown area. Right? This has not produced a livable city by any stretch of the imagination. It has handcuffed the city, made it impossible to transform itself to accommodate the new world, and ensured, perhaps most tragically, that the city sprawls out instead of moving upward. And it's particularly tragic because hundreds die each year in accidents on Mumbai's train systems getting in from far-off areas. This is a city that has, as a result of its restrictions on building, become one of the most expensive places on the planet. This is the purchasing power parity adjusted relationship between metropolitan area size and Class A office rents. This is not my graph, so I do lack aesthetic sense, and I want to make that clear to all the architects in the audience right up, but even I would not try and force this graph on you. It was coming from someone else. But Mumbai is right up there. It's the high point above Delhi. It's the highest number on there. A remarkable thing, right, given the poverty of much of India, and yet it is what has been wrought from these limitations on land use controls, the inability to actually adjust to changing circumstances. Now, when we think about Vancouver's issues, the first thing I think that it's hard not to grapple with is the question as to whether or not today's extraordinarily high prices reflect a permanent situation or a temporary aberration. Certainly, as an American who lived through the great housing convulsion of the last 10 years, it is certainly clear that housing prices go down as well as up. Indeed, statistically, over the past 40-odd years, every dollar that a metropolitan area goes up over a five-year period, it gives back 32 cents on that dollar over the next 5 years. Past price booms are not typically a sign of future price booms. They're a sign of future price collapses. Right? And nowhere is that more obvious than over the past decade in the US, where the give back was not 32 cents on the dollar, but literally 100%. So what I have done here is, along the x-axis, I've shown the percent change in price between 2001 and 2006 across metropolitan areas. Along the y-axis, the vertical axis, I've shown percent change in price 2006 to 2011. That coefficient, it's actually denominated both by the 2001 price. This is a repeat sales index that controls for changes in housing quality. The give back over the 2006-2011 period was not 32 cents on the dollar, but 95 cents on the dollar. It was a tsunami that came in and left our cities. Some of them, as you can tell, like Las Vegas and Phoenix, ending up doing, or Detroit, much worse off than when they started. Those are places that had significant declines. The two places that stand out above are Midland, Texas, and Washington, D.C. Apparently being a hometown to George W. Bush was a particularly good thing over the past 10 years in terms of housing price appreciation for whatever reason. Now, one of the things, it's very hard to explain, this clearly easy credit played some role in it, but it can't explain it all. One of the patterns that shows up when you try to understand this, and I think this is somewhat related to Vancouver, is the enormous power of temperature to explain the size of the boom. This is the relationship between January temperature and which of those cities grew more quickly in terms of prices. As you can see, the boom came in warm places. Perhaps irrational exuberance just abhors cold winters. And then, of course, the price declines occurred in exactly the same way. I can't help thinking, of course, that Vancouver, although it certainly feels very far away from Phoenix, it is sort of the warmest place in Canada, and one does wonder if perhaps there isn't some history repeating itself. Now, one thing that was also clear over this boom, but it appears not to be reversing itself completely over the bust, is that high prices were going on disproportionately in city centers. There have been booms in the past that were about the edges, but when it comes to price growth was higher in the urban centers, and that's what you're seeing here is the relationship between price growth 2001 into 2008 and proximity to the city center. This is part of not just the boom, but a more global phenomenon of the rise of our downtown areas, the increase of demand for cities, which comes from both economics and the tremendous joys of living in cities. Now, normally, when I give talks, I am at my most, I prefer talking about the demand side of cities, because in fact, the demand side is all the stuff we love about cities. The joys of being around other people, the joys of being able to share in common amenities, the pleasures of being in a place which just sings because of its diversity. All of these things are part of the magic of the demand for Vancouver space. It's why high prices are not an unexpected thing. But there's also a second side to urban prices. Right? It's always about the twin scissors of supply and demand. And when high demand hits irreconcilable limits to supply, that's when you get high prices. What you're looking at here is the relationship between price growth between 2001 and 2011 and the amount of building in the metropolitan area as of 2001. Okay? So just the starting period. And what you can see is that the price growth was overwhelmingly in the places that didn't build in the US. There's no repealing those laws of supply and demand. If you place extreme limits on construction, prices will go up. Now, another way to see this is a scatter plot of the entire country. And it shows along the x-axis, it shows population growth 2000 to 2010. Along the y-axis, it shows prices. Okay? Now, there's something that's funny about this. You will notice that the places that build a lot, which means they're the places down there along the horizontal axis, none of those places that build a lot are expensive, right? And look at the places that are expensive. None of the places that are expensive build a lot, right? Again, this is exactly what the core tools of economics tell you. High demand can either be met with enough supply, which keeps prices down to reasonable levels, or it shows up in high prices. It shows up in a town becoming increasingly affordable only to the wealthy. A fear that I think all of us have as we think about our cities, that it is wonderful that people want to live in Vancouver and want to spend high sums of money to it. But at the same time, we all hope that that demand will not mean that people are being shut out of the city. And those are indeed the stakes as we talk about the various barriers to building. We're talking about rules that often have very sound justifications, but every time we say no to an apartment building, we're saying no to families who want the joys of city living. We're saying no to families who want to come, and we're making sure that life in the city is going to be more unaffordable to the people who are already there. This graph shows one of the reasons why you have such differences in building and prices across the US. Land use regulations, which differ dramatically from different parts of the country. And this is the Wharton Index of Land Use Regulations, and it shows you very clearly that the places that are unregulated tend to be quite cheap, and the places that are highly regulated tend to be quite expensive. Many of these areas and many of the most extreme rules are, of course, suburban. Marin County, California, for example, home of the Lucas Ranch, has some areas that have 60-acre minimum lot sizes, right? 60-acre, think about it, it's absolutely mind-boggling. But of course, our cities have also, often for quite understandable reasons, engaged in very draconian limitations. Now, of course, not all the barriers to building are about land use regulations. The work of Albert Saez has emphasized both regulations and topography. Water is also a limitation. Mountains are also a limitation. His combined index shows this relationship between difficulties of building and prices. There's a powerful supply side role that goes on here. Now, as we think about the evidence for the importance of supply and the value of density in alleviating the high prices that come with robust demand. We can look also within particular metropolitan areas, and I happen to live in Boston, which is one of really the ground zeros for NIMBYism or bananaism, if you will. I have the opportunity to see my neighbors get apoplectic with the idea that at a small college will raise a little high-rise building to house a few elderly residents. And I also got the pleasure of seeing my town newspaper celebrate, all the legislators were there, celebrate the opening of exactly one affordable housing unit. Exactly one, right? Which is going to do a lot to alleviate the affordability problem in Greater Boston. Now, what you're seeing here is, in various communities in Boston, decline in permitting over the last 50 years. The various communities have made it more and more difficult to build throughout the area. This is not because we're built out. Because in fact, the places that do build, this is showing the relationship between housing density in 1980 and subsequent building. The only places that do build are those that had a lot of density to begin with. It's not as if the suburban communities are allowing, which have tons of land, are building. In fact, Middlesex County, Massachusetts, where I live, is considerably less dense than Harris County, Texas, which holds Houston. Right? Considerably less dense. Needless to say, it permits almost no new housing relative to Harris County, Texas. But it's not in any sense a lack of land. What it is are rules. This is the distribution by towns, population, land of minimum lot sizes. You'll see the modal number is about an acre. That's what most of these communities allow building, is about an acre. And it's not surprising that these limitations make things very expensive. This is a painful statistical chart, but its message I can boil down to one thing, which is that higher levels of density across these communities translate into lower prices. That unsurprisingly, as you supply more housing, prices become more affordable. Now, when you get to, it's all fun to make, all good news to make fun of suburban NIMBYism, but when we get down to our cities, there are painful choices to be made, okay? And there is no free lunch here. And I know I risk my personal safety, my integrity, by coming to Canada and saying anything negative about the sainted Jane Jacobs. And I want to make it clear that I am as big of a fan as anyone else in this room of the wisdom that she brought to cities. But she did make a mistake when she talked about old buildings and new buildings. She looked at old buildings and new buildings, and she noticed that old buildings were cheap and new buildings were expensive, which led her to conclude that the way to preserve housing affordability in cities was to make sure that no one replaced any old buildings with new buildings, okay? This is not how supply and demand works. There are certainly good cases for preserving heritage districts, okay? But we are not promoting affordability when we freeze cities in amber. And you don't have to look any further than in her home area of Greenwich Village, which was, when she lived there, affordable to ordinary Americans like herself. Now the place has townhouses that start at $5 million apiece, and hedge fund managers only need apply. Right? This is what has happened as a result of this preservation. Now, this is the pattern in Manhattan over the past 50 years. Okay, what you're seeing here is the declining line is declining permits, the rising line is rising prices. Just as New York City got its act under control, get its act in shape in terms of having its social problems be somewhat controlled and its economic boom, it made it more and more difficult to build. The result was a city that became increasingly unaffordable. And those rules are both about permitting, but they're also about limits on various forms of height regulations as well. These are sort of remarkable. It's a limited sample, but this is the fraction of units in buildings that are taller than 20 stories by years in which they're built. And you can see that during the early ages of the century, we were building taller and taller buildings. After the 1970s, New York got shorter, right? Just when it needed the space, right, it went up less, which is a sort of remarkable fact. Now, preservation districts are a difficult call. I'm the son of an architectural historian, right? I believe that our old buildings are architectural treasures to be protected just as much as the Mona Lisa or the Brancacci Chapel. But when we do freeze our cities in amber, this is what results. So if you compare preservation districts with areas outside, that there was a 15% increase in price growth relative to non-districts in Manhattan, $6,000 added cost per unit per year in the historic districts relative to outside them. The change in income in districts relative to non-districts is 25%, right? Meaning they became vastly richer than the city as a whole. Poor people got pushed out of these districts. And of course, the change in percent white, right, was a 11 percentage point shift. So minorities got pushed substantially out of these preservation districts. So we very much preserved the past, but we did so at the expense of the future. And indeed, one way to measure the limitations that a city poses on its building is by looking at the gap between the physical cost of construction and prices, okay, which is the cost of delivering units is the cost of adding an extra floor, right? Because you can always, in fact, add an extra floor on a tall building. So ask yourself, how much does it cost to add the extra floor? And then ask you, how much does that unit sell for? Because in an uncontrolled market, builders would keep on building till the cost equals the price. Well, the top line shows in $2,000 the changing prices. And you can see there's a whopping cycle. The bottom line, prices that units can be sold for per square foot, the bottom line in Manhattan shows the cost of delivering the stuff. So you've seen a widening gulf in that separation. It isn't that it's become all that much more expensive to build, although, as we know, beautiful green glass towers are expensive to put up, and they will never be cheap, affordable options. But by building green glass towers, we limit the push to gentrify middle-income areas. Supply, it's a citywide market. Supply in one area eases demands on the other. And if you want to just compare New York with a city that does a far better job in the US in terms of affordability, just think about Chicago, where Mayor Daley unleashed the cranes along Michigan, Lake Michigan. The result was not cheap houses along Lake Michigan, but the result was a lot less gentrification in the middle-income areas of Chicago, which kept affordability for people throughout. Supply really does work. Now, I want to end with an anecdote on the environment. Because, in fact, one of the reasons to promote affordability is, of course, that we want people to be able to come to live in cities. But another reason is that cities do really have, as our last speaker emphasized, an ability to fight against our most challenging environmental problems. And one of the stories that I find helpful about this is about a young Harvard College graduate who, in a beautiful spring day in 1844, went for a walk in the woods outside of Concord, Massachusetts. And he did a little fishing, and the fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately. But then he came to cook the fish in a chowder. We do that in Massachusetts. We cook a lot of chowders. And the wind, as he cooked the chowder, the wind flicked the flames to the nearby dry grass. And a fire started, and it spread, and it spread. And by the time it was done, it was a raging inferno that had destroyed more than 300 acres of prime Concord woodland. In his day, this man was castigated as an enemy of the environment. The Concord Freeman called him a flibbertigibbet, which I think was pretty bad for 1844. And indeed, it's hard not to think that they were right. I don't know of any Bostonian or Cantabrigian in 1844 who was doing nearly as much damage to the environment as this man was. Oddly, of course, today, he is venerated as the secular saint of American environmentalism. He's Henry David Thoreau, whose book, Walden Pond, appears to preach a gospel about a wonderful thing it is to live surrounded by green spaces. Now, while his own life appears to teach a completely different moral, right? His own life reminds us that we are an extremely destructive species. And indeed, if you love nature, often the best way to take care of it is to stay away from it. As indeed, Thoreau would have done an awful lot of good for nature if he had, in fact, stayed at home rather than going out to cook chowders in the middle of the woods outside of Concord. Now, of course, there's a modern lesson from that, and that's exactly what the last speaker was getting at. This is a map of carbon emissions in Greater Boston, and you'll notice the red spots are the higher emissions. When I started acquiring small children, only economists talk about acquiring small children. When I started acquiring small children about 6 years ago, I moved out to live not far away from where Thoreau did, and started doing almost as much damage to the environment as Thoreau did himself, with the driving and the larger house and so forth. My work with Matthew Kahn, a UCLA environmental economist, has actually gone through and controlled for income and family size and compared carbon emissions in different parts of the country. And these are some of the areas in the country that have the largest differences between living in the central city and outside, based primarily on its smaller units, even holding family size constant and income constant, and its shorter commutes and less driving. In the US, it's primarily not about public transportation. It's actually just about driving shorter distances, which is why, for example, you see Atlanta, Georgia is very high on that list. It's not that people are taking public transportation in Atlanta, Georgia. It's just when they live in the city center, their drives are short. And when they live outside the city, they're driving enormous distances. Or Houston as well. Now, I think a number that sort of emphasizes the stakes of this is if the great growing economies of India and China see their carbon emission levels rise to those seen in the sprawling United States, global carbon emissions go up by 130%. If they stop at the level seen at hyperdense but still wealthy Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by less than 30%, right? Those are the level of the stakes. And that's why, right, Vancouver can lead the way with a denser future. Because, in fact, building up means not building out. Building for pedestrians means not building for cars, right? And this is a future that is, not only livable and fun and productive, but it's also a future that poses much less risk for the planet as well. Thank you very much.